From the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans. On this episode, I am joined by Dr. Brad Lubben, Policy Specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, to discuss his latest policy report column for Nebraska Farmer magazine. As President Trump begins his new term, his administration has introduced a new initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which aims to reshape and reduce the size of federal government. While DOGE itself isn't an official agency, it has been a key part of the administration's messaging on spending cuts. Dr. Lubben's latest column examines what role DOGE might play in influencing federal agricultural programs, including the Farm Bill, crop insurance, and rural development. Brad, thanks for joining me again.
Good to be with you.
Can you just start by explaining how DOGE might fit into the broader policy landscape under the new administration?
Well, it's important to think of, while DOGE itself is not an official department, unless we go through the regulatory or the legislative process of establishing it, it has been central to President Trump's campaign and now his initial weeks in office as an initiative to try and reduce the scope and the scale of government. So it's a focus on pulling back in almost every direction, thinking in terms of programs, also in terms of workers and in terms of spending. And it means that it will reach, or if it has any sort of effectiveness, it will ultimately reach every sort of facet of federal programs and agencies that we might imagine.
And your column notes that past administrations have attempted to reduce government spending, particularly in agriculture. So how might the DOGE approach compare to previous efforts, and what makes it different this time?
Yeah. I think at the moment this is different, perhaps because of the scale, and we'll see if it ultimately has as large of impact as it is currently described. It may also be different, frankly, because this is the era of social media, and we get to almost sort of watch this process unfold in real time. But if you go back, we have historically and periodically been focused on the federal government and the size of government and the amount of federal government spending, all related to concerns about the budget and about federal deficits and ultimately accumulation of federal debt. Well, we could go back to at least the 1990s, and we saw an era where there was a combination of a willingness to address government program reform, particularly welfare reform and other efficiency changes that were a combination of things that ultimately helped lead to a federal budget surplus by 1998. Now, the Republicans listening to this would remember Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America as a primary driver of these cuts. Democrats would remember that President Clinton was also a proponent of an improved efficiency and reform government. So both parties sort of claim a piece of that effort back in the 1990s that ultimately did produce a balanced budget, even a budget surplus. That surplus didn't last long. It lasted 4 years before we were back in deficit spending, and we've seen deficits mushroom since. Go on about a decade, and then there was a joint committee on deficit reduction formed in 2011 in Congress, with a focus on trying to reduce the federal deficit in a post-Great Recession sort of spending spree, a focus on reducing the size and spending in federal government. That joint committee effort, or super committee, called on the different authorizing committees in Congress to try and find cuts. Agriculture was one of the few committees, if any, that actually proposed real cuts to programs in accordance with instructions from the super committee. And agriculture ultimately was sort of charged with trying to find $25 billion in cuts to farm programs over a 10-year budget horizon. Now we have DOGE going forth and looking for cuts in all facets, partly because of a focus on the size of government and maybe the scope of government, and certainly partly because of different budget priorities and political priorities about which programs are favored and which programs are targeted for reductions. But we've also seen a rollout now just this week with action in both the House and the Senate to move towards a budget resolution and in the House, at least a talking number at the moment is a proposal for the House Ag Committee to find $230 billion in cuts. So a decade ago or 15 years ago, it was find 25 billion in cuts. Now it's almost a tenfold increase to see if there might be an opportunity for 230 billion in cuts. We've tried it. We have occasionally found ways to reform federal policy and try and rein in spending and programs, but we'll have to see whether this go round looks any different.
Well, farm bill programs, crop insurance, conservation programs, those have historically been mentioned as potential targets for budget cuts. How might DOGE impact those programs specifically, and what should producers be paying attention to?
I think as we watch the efforts of DOGE to try and identify programs and areas for cuts, of course, the obvious sort of target is to cut fraud, waste, and abuse. Well, what's waste? Is it programs that are spending inefficiently, or is it program spending that isn't having an effective impact? Or is it program spending on priorities that are simply not shared by this administration in comparison to the previous administration? So trying to figure out what's targeted and what's not, or how broad the scope here is an important consideration. The DOGE efforts coming from the White House sort of might move hand in hand here with the congressional budget resolution efforts to try and find budget cuts. All of those paint a picture of a very different sort of budget scenario this year than we've had in the last few years. I note with some irony that the farm bill debate, of course, has lingered on into 2025 when a farm bill could not get to the finish line in 2023. So we moved a one-year extension. It did not get to the finish line again in 2024. We moved to another one-year extension to debate it again in 25. Well, if we were fighting over nickels and dimes in 2023 and 2024, we were fighting over how to find dollars to fund the additions or the changes to the farm bill that we wanted to see. If we were fighting over nickels and dimes and couldn't get to the finish line, I suspect in 2025 we're fighting over billions and billions, and not how much we might add, but billions and billions and how much we might cut. And so it's a very different environment, or at least it appears to be a very different environment right now than we've had just in the past few years. And that paints a different picture for not just the farm bill, but frankly, for any major piece of legislation trying to move through Congress.
And when it comes to public opinion on this, in your column, you referenced the 2023 Nebraska rural poll conducted here by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and that highlighted varying levels of support for different farm bill programs, which maybe predictably differed depending on if the respondent was involved in farming or not. So how do you think that public sentiment might influence policymakers as they consider budget reductions?
You know, the challenge here of any major federal policy or even state policy is that it's so complex that very few people really sort of understand the depth of it. And I would not profess to be myself to be one that can walk through every program and every agency in the government. But when we look at it in general, we may be familiar with parts of it because of our profession or our livelihood or our geography and so forth. We may be familiar with parts of the farm bill or parts of broader legislation, but we just know it in aggregate that it is huge and massive. And so it's quite easy, frankly, to focus on the big bill and say, clearly there's something that can be cut in there. That's a large bill. It's excessive federal spending. We need to be able to find cuts and improve efficiency. And then when the proposed cuts come and they actually hit programs that we're familiar with, suddenly it's a realization that says, oh, but that I know works, or that I know has a role, and it's a little more painful to see it actually hit close to home. There's an old adage somewhere about, you pay most attention to what you spend on yourself. You pay least attention when you spend other people's money on other people. And a lot of federal policy and programs seem like spending public money, other people's money on other people. Well, when it's programs that spend money on me specifically, it gets very familiar very quickly. Somewhere in there is a story that says effectively, we might all be for improved government efficiency and maybe even reduced spending in total, but yet we're also all somewhat protective of the program that we think we're most tied into or benefited from. And that's true if we looked at some of our rural poll data, our annual poll of rural Nebraskans. If you ask specifically about farm program spending, we ask about a farm bill and some of the programs in it. Well, rural audiences, rural participants with a farm connection were more favorable for continued levels of support for government farm programs than the general public, but they were less favorable towards continued government support for food assistance than the general public. The general public being other rural Nebraskans. You put that together and it's not an indictment specifically of a Nebraska farm population. It's a general recognition that we're more for the things that we know work for us, and less for those that must go somewhere else. That's the challenge of any of this legislation, is even if we sort of agree in part that that broad restructuring the federal government and control or reining in government spending is a critical issue. When it actually comes to identifying where the cuts might be and what they might actually mean, then it becomes much more difficult to swallow. So there's quite a bit to work through here, but as I wrote in the column, if DOGE, and if you look at Department of Government Efficiency, it kind of looks like DOG as opposed to DOGE. Well, if DOGE bites, if DOGE is going to hunt and it's going to find these kinds of programs to cut, then it's also eventually going to bite. And these program cuts are going to hurt. And it's a question of whether we're willing to take on some of that pain for the sake of overall government spending, or whether we at some point sort of reach a threshold where we're fighting against further efforts.
Yeah, and going beyond agriculture, many federal programs like broadband expansion and renewable energy incentives have played key roles in rural development. So could DOGE's influence extend beyond ag to impact broader rural initiatives?
Yes, I think while I might have written about ag programs, and certainly my focus predominantly has been on agricultural policy, but rural policy matters too. And so, yes, it's not just what potential cuts or program changes might mean for federal safety nets down the road, commodity programs and crop insurance, amongst other things, but it's also what it might mean for rural development and rural places. And that includes dollars that might be spent on broadband. It includes dollars that might be spent in, or incentives that might be provided in the bioenergy and renewable energy area. But it's across the board there. If we have some early indications from the administration in terms of what they've tried to freeze, that they have frozen some contracts for climate practices. What Tom Vilsack sent out the door in terms of contracts for climate smart commodities, well, the current administration is trying to pull back some of those contracts and the spending for producers that were part of those agreements. So it might be climate, it might be rural broadband, it might be bioenergy. You can identify a lot of targets that the previous administration or the current administration has already sort of signaled toward, and you can wonder what those potential cuts might look like if they were to come to pass.
So this can all be overwhelming, especially with something so new and perhaps drastic. So what are some key takeaways for farmers and ranchers as they navigate potential policy shifts under the new administration? Your advice to them as they try to follow this situation?
Yeah, I think the general advice is one that I give almost every month in the column. You have to stay engaged. You have to know what's coming and what's happening. There was, perhaps quite a bit of enthusiasm back in the election from many rural places that were supportive of Trump and voting in an administration that they thought would bring reform and changes in priorities and direction. Well, some of that change is happening, and now it actually might have direct impact on the same rural Nebraskans as well. So you have to stay engaged, you have to be informed. It's not just the traditional engagement process in terms of knowing how to contact your congressman or your senator on Capitol Hill, but this is happening within the executive branch, and it's knowing those connections and understanding how the process works in the executive branch as well. So you've got to understand the process, and you got to work with connections and work with organizations that have those connections to engage in that process.
That's Dr. Brad Lubben, Extension Policy Specialist with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and we've been discussing his latest policy report column written for Nebraska Farmer magazine, which you can find excerpted on our Center for Ag Profitability website at cap.unl.edu, as well as in the notes to this podcast description. Brad, thanks so much for the time again.
Thank you, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.